Hello, beautiful friends. I'm Laurel Bleadon-Maffei with Illuminating Souls, and I welcome you to Sleepy Bedtime Blessings, a podcast designed to help you relax, rest, and fall asleep. I am an angelic practitioner, a spiritual teacher, an encourager of souls. During my daytime hours, I love helping you connect with your angels and deepen in your divine guidance. And I do this through angel sessions, soul mentoring, and a variety of classes. And I also have a Facebook page called Illuminating Souls, where I post daily inspirational messages for you. And now I'm here to help you transition into a beautiful, restful sleep. You see, I'm someone who has been listening to sleep podcasts for years now, and they've become an essential part of my self-care. And I love them so much, I was guided to create this podcast for you. So if you're new to the world of sleep podcasts, I have some suggestions for you. It can take a little while to get used to listening to a voice whispering to you as you drift off to sleep. But I believe there's a part of us, sort of ancestral wisdom, if you will, that comes from generations and generations of oral storytelling, that a part of our consciousness knows what it is to listen to a narrative, especially one that isn't very important. One that you're not going to have to remember. One that you just get to travel with until you're able to let go of the thread of consciousness that is so precious and beautiful. So this is that kind of podcast. And it may take you a little while to get used to it. I love to put in earbuds. That's how I listen. My husband and I have a different sleep schedule in that I usually go to sleep an hour or so before he does. And I put in my earbuds and I pick an episode of one of my favorite sleep podcasts. And rarely am I still awake 20 minutes later? And I know this because I have no idea what the podcast was about usually. So it may seem strange that I'm making a podcast that I hope you won't remember. But if you are still awake, the end of the episode, you can always start another one, and the angels and I will keep you company. So this episode will be about an hour long, so you'll have plenty of time, no pressure. I'll start off by bringing in the angels and sharing some of their love with you. And then I'll read you a bedtime story. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you from Anne of Green Gables. And you may notice that I'm skipping around a bit with the books that I'm reading to you. And that's because I want you to have a variety to choose from. And the truth is, you're probably not following the stories very closely, because if this podcast is doing what I hope it does, I hope you're not following every single story. But if you are, I'm glad you're here. And all of the books that I'm reading to you are in the public domain. So you can easily go into Google Books or your library and download them and read them while you're awake, because they're wonderful books. So we'll first start off by calling in the angels. So beautiful angels on high, I invite you to be here with us. I invite you and ask you to infuse this broadcast with love, soothing, beautiful love, so that everyone who is hearing this message receives your blessings and your compassion and your light. And so, dear ones, I invite you to take a big, deep breath in and out and cozy on in. Curl up underneath your favorite blanket. Let your body get comfortable. This is your time to rest. And something about the angels you should know is it works best if you ask for their help. So you can just invite the angels in. And with your permission, they will help begin clearing your energy field. Especially clearing your energy field of anything that does not belong to you. Often we pick up energy that is not ours. It's very easy to do. So one of the easiest ways the angels can begin helping you is by clearing that which is not yours. So just let your energy field be cleared to help give you a beautiful sanctuary, a cocoon, if you will, of light. Allow yourself to receive fully the love of God. There is so much love here for you. God and the angels love you beyond time and space. They love you without condition. Take a breath in and out and let this love wash over you. You are a blessing in this world, and probably, like most of us, you are moving through a time of transition. Almost all of us are. You are beginning to open to even more of who you are. You are opening to even more of your gifts and abilities. And with your permission, your angels will help you by bringing to you sparks of inspiration, which hopefully will start showing up in the next few days. You don't have to know what they are right now. For right now, tuck on in and drift off. And the angels will seed blessings in your name while you sleep. They also carry for you the prayers of your heart. And they also help amplify your prayers and intentions. So you can rest now. And the angels will watch over you. You can bathe in the goodness, knowing that you are loved. You are cherished. And you are a blessing in this world. I am so deeply grateful to be here with you. And so while you rest, I'm going to read to you a bedtime story. Our story tonight is Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, written, I believe, in 1908. Now, I'll share with you, I did not read this book when I was a little girl. Somehow, it wasn't on my radar. But I fell in love with the Netflix series, Anne with an E, which introduced me to this book. And so we're going to start it tonight. And we begin with Chapter 1, Mrs. Rachel Lynde is Surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done well. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet, with all of this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in awed voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eyes. She was sitting there one morning in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in a bridal flush of pinky white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man who Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing on his big red brook field away over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information on anything in his whole life. And yet, here was Matthew Cuthbert at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea, and he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel deftly put this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions. But Matthew so rarely went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated having to go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what, and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel sat out. She had not far to go. The big, rambling, orchard-embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow man without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road, which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. "It's just staying, that's what," she said, as she stepped along the deep, rutted, grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. "It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living away back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though dear knows if there were, there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people, to be sure. They seem contented enough, but then I suppose they're used to it." With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows, and the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard over as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial speck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows looked east and west. Through the west one looking out the backyard came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom-white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding slender birches down in the hollow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken a mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea, but the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only one kind of crabapple preserve and one kind of cake, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla said briskly. "This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks?" Something that for lack of any other name might be called friendship existed, and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind, with 2 wire hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was. But there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. "We're all pretty well," said Mrs. Rachel. "I was kind of afraid you weren't, though, when I saw Matthew starting off today. I thought maybe he was going to the doctor's." Marilla's lips twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel up. She had known that the sight of Matthew's jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. "Oh no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday," she said. "Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight." If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. It was unsupposable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel was almost forced to suppose it. "Are you in earnest, Marilla?" she demanded when her voice returned to her. "Yes, of course," said Marilla, as if getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia were part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm, instead of being an unheard-of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt that she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points. A boy! Exclamation point. Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy! Exclamation point. From an orphan asylum! Exclamation point. Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this, nothing. "What on earth put such a notion in your head?" she demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked, and must perforce be disapproved. "Well, we've been thinking about it for some time. All winter, in fact," returned Marilla. "Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopeton in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited here and knows all about it. So Matthew and I have talked it over and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew is getting up in years, you know. He's 60, and he isn't so spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal, and you know how desperately hard it is to get hired help. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out a boy when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going, so we sent her word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 11. We decided that would be the best age, old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up proper. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station saying they were coming on the 5:30 train tonight. So Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now, having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. "Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plain. I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing, a risky thing, that is. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him, nor what his disposition is like, nor what sort of parents he has had or how badly he's likely to turn out. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have said, for mercy's sake, not to think of such a thing. That's what." This job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor to alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. "I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself. But Matthew was terribly set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there's risks in pretty near everything a body does in this world. There's risks in people having children of their own. If it comes to that, they don't always turn out well. And then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we're getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it will turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you if he burns Green Gables down or puts strychnine in the well. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did just that and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in that instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla, as if poisoning wells were a purely feminine accomplishment and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But there, she wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting that it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she concluded to go up to the road to Robert Bell's and tell the news. It would certainly make a sensation second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. So she took herself away, somewhat to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, exclaimed Mrs. Rachel when she was safely out in the lane. It does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one, and no mistake. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than his own grandfather, if so be he's ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. It seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the new house was built. If they ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them, I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. My, but I pity him, that's what. So said Mrs. Rachel to the wild rose bushes out of the fullness of her heart. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. Chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. Matthew Cuthbert and the sorrel mare jogged comfortably over the 8 miles to Bright River. It was a pretty road, running along between snug farm stands, with now and again a bit of balsamy fir wood to drive through or a hollow where wild plums hung out their filmy bloom. The air was sweet with the breath of many apple orchards, and the meadows sloped away in the distance to the horizon mists of pearl and purple, while the little birds sang as if it were the one day of summer in all the year. Matthew enjoyed the drive after his own fashion, except during the moments when he met women and had to nod to them. For in Prince Edward Island, you are supposed to nod to all and sundry you meet on the road, whether you know them or not. Matthew dreaded all women except Marilla and Mrs. Rachel. He had an uncomfortable feeling that the mysterious creatures were secretly laughing at him. He may have been quite right in thinking so, for he was an odd-looking personage, with an ungainly figure and long iron-gray hair that touched his stooping shoulders, and a full, soft brown beard, which he had worn ever since he was 20. In fact, he had looked at 20 very much as he looked at 60, lacking a little of the grayness. When he reached Bright River, there was no sign of any train. He thought he was too early, so he tied his horse in the yard of a small Bright River hotel and went over to the station house. The long platform was almost deserted, the only living creature in sight being a girl who was sitting on a pile of shingles at the extreme end. Matthew, barely noting that it was a girl, sidled past her as quickly as possible without looking at her. Had he looked, he could hardly have failed to notice the tense rigidity and expectation of her attitude and expression. She was sitting there waiting for something or somebody, and since sitting and waiting was the only thing to do just then, she sat and waited with all her might and main. Matthew encountered the station master locking up the ticket office to go home for supper, and asked him if the 5:30 train would soon be along. "The 5:30 train has been in and gone half an hour ago," answered the brisk official. "But there was a passenger dropped off for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there on the shingles. I asked her to go to the ladies' waiting room, but she informed me gravely that she preferred to stay outside. There was more scope for imagination, she said. She's a case, I should say." "I'm not expecting a girl," said Matthew blankly. "It's a boy I've come for. He should be here. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was to bring him over from Nova Scotia for me." The station master whistled. "Guess there's been some mistake," he said. "Mrs. Spencer came off the train with that girl and gave her to my charge. She said you and your sister were adopting her from an orphan asylum and that you would be along for her presently. That's all I know about it. And I haven't got any more orphans concealed hereabouts." "I don't understand," said Matthew helplessly, wishing that Marilla was at hand to cope with the situation. "Well, you'd better question the girl," said the station master carelessly. "I dare say she'll be able to explain. She's got a tongue of her own, that's certain. Maybe they were out of boys of the brand you wanted." He walked jauntily away, being hungry, and the unfortunate Matthew was left to do that which was harder for him than bearding a lion in its den. Walk up to a girl, a strange girl, an orphan girl, and demand of her why she wasn't a boy. Matthew groaned in spirit as he turned around and shuffled gently down the platform towards her. She had been watching him ever since he passed her, and she had her eyes on him now. Matthew was not looking at her and would not have seen what she was really like if he had been, but an ordinary observer would have seen this. A child of about 11, garbed in a very short, very tight, very ugly dress of yellowish gray wincey. She wore a faded brown sailor hat, and beneath the hat, extended down her back, were 2 braids of very thick, decidedly red hair. Her face was small, white, and thin, also much freckled. Her mouth was large, and so were her eyes, which looked green in some lights and moods and gray in others. So far, the ordinary observer, an extraordinary observer, might have seen that the chin was very pointed and pronounced, that the big eyes were full of spirit and vivacity, that the mouth was sweet-lipped and expressive, that the forehead was broad and full and short. Our discerning, extraordinary observer might have concluded that no commonplace soul inhabited the body of this stray, woman-child, of whom shy Matthew Cuthbert was so ludicrously afraid. Matthew, however, was spared the ordeal of speaking first, for as soon as she concluded that he was coming to her, she stood up, grasping with one thin brown hand the handle of a shabby, old-fashioned carpet bag. The other she held out to him. "I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables," she said in a clear, sweet voice. "I'm very glad to meet you. I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming for me, and I was imagining all the things that might have happened to prevent you. I had made up my mind that if you didn't come for me tonight, I'd go down to the track to that big wild cherry tree at the bend and climb up into it to stay all night. I wouldn't be a bit afraid, and it would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree all white with bloom in the moonshine, don't you think? You could imagine your dwelling in marble halls, couldn't you? And I was quite sure you would come for me in the morning if you didn't tonight." Matthew had taken the scrawny little hand awkwardly in his. Then and there, he decided what to do. He could not tell the child with the glowing eyes that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla do that. She couldn't be left at Bright River anyhow, no matter what mistake had been made. So all questions and explanations might as well be deferred until he was safely back at Green Gables. "I'm sorry I was late," he said shyly. "Come along. The horse is over in the yard. Give me your bag." "Oh, I can carry it," the child responded cheerfully. "It isn't heavy. I've got all my worldly goods in it, but it isn't heavy. And if it isn't carried in just a certain way, the handle pulls out. So I better keep it because I know the exact knack of it. It's an extremely old carpet bag. Oh, I am very glad you've come, even if it would have been nice to sleep in a wild cherry tree. We've got a long drive to a long piece, haven't we?" Mrs. Spencer said. It was 8 miles. "I'm glad because I love driving. Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody, not really. But the asylum was the worst. I've only been in it for 4 months, but that was enough. I don't suppose you ever were an orphan in an asylum, so you can't possibly understand what it is like. It's worse than anything you could imagine. Mrs. Spencer said it was wicked of me to talk like that, but I didn't mean to be wicked. It's so easy to be wicked without knowing it, isn't it? They were good, you know, the asylum people. But there is so little scope for the imagination in an asylum, only just in the other orphans. It was pretty interesting to imagine things about them, to imagine that perhaps the girl who sat next to you was really the daughter of a belted earl who had been stolen away from her parents in her infancy by a cruel nurse who died before she could confess. I used to lie awake at night and imagine things like that because I didn't have time in the day. I guess that's why I'm so thin. I am dreadful thin, ain't I? There isn't a pick on my bones. I do love to imagine I'm nice and plump with dimples in my elbows. With this, Matthew's companion stopped talking, partly because she was out of breath, and partly because they had reached the buggy. Not another word did she say until they had left the village and were driving down a steep little hill, the road part of which had been cut so deeply into the soft soil that the banks, fringed with blooming wild cherry trees and slim white birches, were several feet above their heads. The child put out her hand and broke off a branch of wild plum that brushed against the side of the buggy. "Isn't that beautiful? "What did that tree leaning out from the bank all white and lacy make you think of?" she asked. "Well, no, I don't know," said Matthew. "Why, a bride, of course, a bride all in white, with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what she would look like. I don't ever expect to be a bride myself. I'm so homely, nobody will ever want to marry me unless I might be a foreign missionary. I suppose a foreign missionary mightn't be very particular, but I do hope that someday I shall have a white dress. That is my highest ideal of earthly bliss. I just love pretty clothes, and I've never had a pretty dress in my life that I can remember. But of course, it's all the more to look forward to, isn't it? And then I can imagine that I am dressed gorgeously. This morning when I left the asylum, I felt so ashamed because I had to wear this horrid old wincey dress. All the orphans had to wear them, you know. A merchant in Hopetown last winter donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Some people said it was because he couldn't sell it, but I'd rather believe that it was out of the kindness of his heart, wouldn't you? When we got on the train, I felt as if everybody must be looking at me and pitying me. But then I just went to work and imagined that I had on the most beautiful pale blue silk dress, because when you are imagining, you might as well imagine something worth it. And a big hat all flowers and nodding plumes, and a gold watch and kid gloves and boots. I felt cheered up right away, and I enjoyed my trip to the island with all my might. I wasn't a little bit sick coming over in the boat. Neither was Mrs. Spencer, although she generally is. She said she hadn't time to get sick watching to see that I didn't fall overboard. She said she never saw the beat of me for prowling about, but if it kept her from being seasick, it's a mercy. And I wanted to see everything that it was to be seen on that boat, because I didn't know whether I'd ever have another opportunity. Oh, there are a lot more cherry trees all in bloom. This island is the bloomiest place. I just love it already, and I'm so glad I'm going to live here. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to imagine I was living here, but I never really expected I would. It's delightful when your imagination comes true, isn't it? But those red roads are so funny. When we got into the train at Charlottetown and the red roads began to flash by, I asked Mrs. Spencer what made them red, and she said she didn't know, for pity's sake, and not to ask her any more questions. She said I must have asked her 1,000 already. I suppose I had too, but how are you going to find out about things if you don't ask questions? And what does make the roads red? Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew. Well, that is one of the things to find out sometime. Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just makes me feel glad to be alive. It's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we know all about everything, would it? There'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? But am I talking too much? People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? If you say so, then I'll stop. Well, I can stop when I make up my mind to do so, although it is difficult. Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself. Like most quiet folks, he liked talkative people when they were willing to do the talking themselves, and did not expect him to keep up his end of it. But he had never expected to enjoy the society of a little girl. Women were bad enough in all conscience, but little girls were worse. He detested the way they had of sidling past him timidly with sideways glances, as if they expected him to gobble them up at a mouthful if they ventured to say a word. That was the Avonlea type of well-bred little girl. But this freckled witch was very different, and although he found it rather difficult for his slower intelligence to keep up with her brisk mental process, he thought that he kind of liked her chatter. So he said, as shyly as usual, "Oh, you can talk as much as you like, I don't mind." "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to get along fine together. It's such a relief to talk when one wants to and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me 1,000,000 times if I've had once. And people laugh at me because I use big words. But if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you?" "Well, now that seems reasonable," said Matthew. "Mrs. Spencer said that my tongue must be hung in the middle, but it isn't. It's firmly fastened at one end. Mrs. Spencer said your place was named Green Gables. I asked her all about it, and she said there were trees all around it. I was gladder than ever. I just love trees. And there weren't any at all about the asylum. Only a few poor, weeny-teeny things out in front with little whitewashed, cagey things about them. They just looked like the orphans themselves, those trees did. It used to make me want to cry to look at them. I used to say to them, 'Oh, you poor little things. If you were out in great big woods with other trees all around you, and little mosses and June bells growing all over your roots, and a brook not far away, and birds singing in your branches, you could grow, couldn't you? But you can't where you are. I know just exactly how you feel, little trees.' I felt sorry to leave them behind this morning. You do get so attached to things like that, don't you? Is there a brook anywhere near Green Gables? I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that." "Well, no, yes, there's one right below the house." "Fancy! It's always been one of my dreams to live near a brook. I never expected I would, though." "Dreams don't often come true, do they? Wouldn't it be nice if they did? But just now I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't feel exactly perfectly happy because—" She twitched one of her long, glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. "What color would you call this?" Matthew was not used to deciding on the tints of ladies' tresses, but in this case, there couldn't be much doubt. "It's red, ain't it?" he said. The girl let the braid drop back with a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes and to exhale forth all the sorrow of the ages. "Yes, it's red. Now you see why I can't be perfectly happy. Nobody could who has red hair. I don't mind the other things so much, the freckles and the green eyes and my skinniness. I can imagine them away. I can imagine that I have beautiful rose leaf complexion and lovely starry violet eyes. But I cannot imagine that red hair away. I do my best. I think to myself, now my hair is a glorious black, black as the raven's wing. But all the time I know it's just plain red and it breaks my heart. It will be my lifelong sorrow. I read of a girl once in a novel who had a lifelong sorrow, but it wasn't red hair. Her hair was pure gold rippling back from her alabaster brow. What is an alabaster brow? I never could find out. Can you tell me?" "Well, now I'm afraid I can't," said Matthew, who was getting a little dizzy. He felt as he had once felt in his rash youth, when another boy had enticed him on the merry-go-round at a picnic. Well, whatever it was, it must have been something nice because she was divinely beautiful. Have you ever imagined what it must feel like to be divinely beautiful? "Well, now, no, I haven't," confessed Matthew. "I have often. Which would you rather be if you had the choice? Divinely beautiful, or dazzlingly clever, or angelically good?" "Well, now, I don't know, certainly." "Neither do I. I can never decide. But it doesn't make much real difference, for it isn't likely I'll ever be either." It's certain I'll never be angelically good, Mrs. Spencer says. Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Oh, Mr. Cuthbert! Well, that was not what Mrs. Spencer had said. Neither had the child tumbled out of the buggy, nor had Matthew done anything astonishing. They had simply rounded a curve in the road and found themselves in the avenue. The avenue, so called by the Newbridge people, was a stretch of road 400 or 500 yards long, completely arched over with huge, wide-spreading apple trees, planted years ago by an eccentric old farmer. Overhead was one long canopy of snowy, fragrant blooms. Below the boughs, the air was full of a purple twilight, and far ahead, a glimpse of painted sunset sky shone like a great rose window at the end of a cathedral aisle. Its beauty seemed to strike the child dumb. She leaned back in the buggy, her thin hands clasped before her, her face lifted rapturously to the white splendor above. Even when they had passed out and were driving down the long slope to Newbridge, she never moved or spoke. Still with rapt face, she gazed afar into the sunset west with eyes that saw visions trooping splendidly across the glowing background. Through Newbridge, a bustling little village where dogs barked at them and small boys hooted, and curious faces peered from the windows as they drove, still in silence. When 3 more miles had dropped away behind them, the child had not spoken. She could keep silence, it was evident, as energetically as she could talk. And with that, my gorgeous, beautiful friends, this seems like a beautiful place to bid you good night. Sweet dreams. Know that you are loved. And we'll talk again soon. Blessings to you.